So for this final lecture in the mini-series on the OCR A-level option West African kingdoms, we're going to look at the final kingdom which is looked at in the ebook, which is the Kingdom of Benin. The Kingdom of Benin is actually located in the south of what today is the Republic of Nigeria, and it's one of the longest lasting kingdoms in West African history. It was present when the Portuguese arrived there in the 1480s, and the last Oba of Benin only finally was deposed in 1897 with the formal imposition of British colonial rule at the end of the 19th century. One of the fascinating things about the Republic of Benin, I think particularly for students, is the fact that it's one of the easiest really to study and to get a sense of as a world, and as a world which is quite different to the world we live in today, because of the artefacts which were produced by Benin, and those were the famous Benin Bronzes. When the British invaded Benin in 1897, they found the royal palace filled with these beautiful sculptures, bronze carvings, bronze casts, which had been made over the previous 400-500 years by master craftsmen in the palace of the Oba, the ruler of Benin. Now, at that time, it was thought impossible that this work could have been produced by African craftsmen from their own initiative, and it was assumed that some kind of Portuguese influence, Portuguese teaching must have been involved in this. Of course, now that's seen to be a very silly way of approaching what is clearly a Benin aesthetic and a Benin worldview and a Benin history. Because what these bronzes in the palace of the Oba did was they were really histories. It was a bit analogous to those of you who've studied the Norman conquest, to the Bayeux tapestry. They were accounts of different episodes in royal lives, in the history of each Oba, and the palace therefore was a kind of living history, and these bronzes were what recorded that. Now, as was typical at the time, the bronzes were taken from Benin and they were distributed widely through European museums. Many of them can still be seen in the British Museum. There's in the Africa rooms, which are downstairs towards the back of the British Museum. You will find many of the Benin bronzes in the Africa rooms there, and also in other museums, both in Britain and in Europe, you will find these bronzes. So the bronzes are a wonderful window onto the culture of Benin and a wonderful way of really making real such a fascinating and distant history. So the question we're going to look at is, how important are the Benin bronzes in understanding Benin history? And there are various different ways of looking at that. The first is to do with how the bronzes are made, the metals which were used. Now, the Portuguese first arrived to trade in Benin in the 1480s, and very quickly the main trade item which they were exchanging with the people of Benin were copper-made arm rings, or manillas. Now, what's very interesting is that archaeological digs in Benin have uncovered large amounts of copper artifacts, but only 7 arm rings, and only 2 of those actually seem to be of European origin. So the logical conclusion is that many of these arm rings were melted down. This imported currency was melted down, and we do know that the 16th century saw a large expansion in the production of the bronzes. In fact, visitors to the palace of the Oba of Benin in the 17th century described the huge numbers of these bronzes and the way in which they depicted the history of Benin in the kingdom. So essentially, the expansion of trade in the 16th century saw the expansion of the import of copper as a kind of money, which was then used by the rulers of Benin as a way of constructing the history of the kingdom, but also constructing a different kind of understanding of Benin identity and Benin aesthetics. So that's the other important thing, I think, to start with about the bronzes as a way of understanding Benin history. How do they do that? Firstly, some of them actually depict the Portuguese, so they give an impression of how people in Benin saw the trade and also what was important to them about it. For example, the weaponry which was brought, but also some of the luxury items which the Portuguese traded. Secondly, you can also see the kind of apparel which warriors in the Kingdom of Benin wore, the importance of swords, for example, and the importance of cowries. Now, cowries became a currency in Benin in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were also imported through this trade. So they begin to give a sense of the way in which both aesthetics, a changing sense of identity, and this rising trade were all connected. So that's a very important aspect of the bronzes in terms of linking both money and power, and the way in which this was constructed in Benin. But on the other hand, it's also very interesting to think about what Benin traded in response. One of the fascinating things about Benin as a kingdom is that by the 1530s, they really turned their back on what the Portuguese wanted. The Portuguese were keen to develop a slave trade, as in many parts of Africa. But by the 1530s, the Obas of Benin rejected that, and they refused to engage in the slave trade. In fact, through the later 16th and right into the later 17th century, the main export of the Republic of Benin were locally woven cloth, known as ambassis, which were traded both across various parts of West Africa. You could find them in different trading centres in what's now Republic of Ghana, other parts of West Africa. And actually they were traded further afield, even as far as Brazil. What happened by the end of the 17th century was that in Benin, these ambassis, these cloths, found it increasingly hard to compete with the growing imports of cloth from Europe and in fact from India, which were coming in and were sold and were very attractive to local consumers. And because of that, by the middle of the 18th century, the Obas of Benin had to turn to renewing the engagement in the slave trade. However, for 200 years, for 2 centuries, while the huge imports of copper and the expansion in the production of the bronzes were taking place, Benin had not been engaging in the slave trade. So this definition of an aesthetic and identity is something which occurred completely outside of what many people associate as the main trading relationship between Africa and Europe at that time. I think another thing, and an important thing which we could say about the Benin Bronzes, is that they very much represent a metaphor for the way in which colonialism has shaped the way in which people think people in Europe particularly, and in America perhaps, may think about African history. The fact that when they were first brought to Europe in the end of the 19th century, it was seen as impossible that they might have been produced by Africans, gives a real sense of the poverty of the historical imagination in Europe at that time when it came to thinking about African history, and the lack of understanding which existed. The way in which the bronzes themselves left the palace, where they had a vital ceremonial, aesthetic and historical role, and were deposited in museums around Europe, and the debates which now exist as to the possibilities of returning some of those bronzes to West Africa, is very much symptomatic of many of the debates which have happened about the migration of vital cultural productions from their homes to museums in the global north. And the ways in which those bronzes themselves now can tell a story and a narrative of a vital part of African history and of world history, but not in the country of origin, is also very much representative and symbolic of the way in which the bronzes can help us think not only about what Benin itself was like, but also about how people have constructed Benin since, and the importance that has now for thinking about histories in the 21st century. So the Benin Bronzes, to conclude, are really almost a unique historical source, and they're the sorts of source which, as I mentioned in the introductory lecture to this mini-series, can help you to think about history in a different way. They offer a different voice, a different perspective, a different view on the past from the traditional texts which many of you may be familiar with using. And it's actually by looking at that different voice and that different perspective that you get a much deeper sense of what Benin itself might have been like, and also of why its history may be important in thinking about your own place in the world today, and about this course, which I hope you've enjoyed.